Some secrets don't stay buried. They walk back into your life wearing an apron, carrying a child with your eyes. And everything you built on blood and silence begins to crack. If you've ever loved someone so completely that losing them rewired who you are, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning Damien Moretti walked into Café Solène, he was not a man looking for ghosts. He was a man in the business of certainties. Every movement he made was calculated. The charcoal suit pressed to a sharp edge, the cufflinks catching light like warnings, the black car idling at the curb outside with two of his men sitting silent and patient as loaded chambers. Damien did not drift. He did not wander. When Damien Moretti entered a room, the room adjusted to him, not the other way around. But certainties are liars. He had chosen Café Solène for its discretion, a quiet neighborhood corner on the east side of the city, far from the glass towers and surveillance corridors of downtown, far from the eyes that tracked his movement through the upper echelons of organized power. The cafe was small. It smelled of roasted coffee and old wood and something faintly sweet that he couldn't name. 7 tables, a chalkboard menu, a ceiling fan rotating slowly overhead like an old man thinking. Victor Caruso had suggested it. Victor was Isabella's father, the Caruso patriarch, old money and old violence. And this meeting was supposed to be the final formality before the wedding. A quiet lunch, a handshake. The last piece of a 5-year negotiation that would merge the Moretti organization with the Caruso network into something neither federal task forces nor rival families could dismantle. Isabella Romano, soon to be Isabella Moretti, though she carried the Caruso blood, sat beside him in a pale cream dress, her dark hair pinned back, her perfume expensive and particular. She was 29 and beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, precisely constructed, deliberately presented. She was also sharp and cold-eyed beneath the softness, which was one of the reasons Damien had agreed to the arrangement. He didn't want a woman who didn't understand what she was marrying into. He didn't love her. She didn't love him either. They both understood this and found it, if anything, professionally reassuring. Victor Caruso was already at the corner table when they arrived, his 2 men standing near the back wall with their hands folded. Victor was 71, thickening at the jowl, still carrying the posture of a man who had once broken other men with his hands and not particularly regretted it. He stood when Damien and Isabella approached, kissed his daughter on the cheek, and shook Damien's hand with the careful grip of a man measuring grip for grip. "Quiet place," Damien said, settling into the chair across from Victor. "That's the point," Victor said. And then she came from behind the counter. Damien registered her the way he registered everything, peripherally first, a shape moving in the corner of his vision, then more deliberately as the shape resolved into a person carrying a coffee tray. She was wearing a dark apron over a simple gray blouse. Her hair was darker than he remembered, pulled back loosely. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a quality to her movement that he would have described, if pressed, as tired. Not lazy, not defeated, but the specific tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had simply learned to carry it. His hand stopped moving. Everything stopped moving. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't slow motion. It was just stopped. The conversation at the table became noise. The ceiling fan continued its rotation above them, indifferent. The city went on outside the plate glass window. Nora Bennett set the coffees down on the adjacent table, not his table, the one beside it, and turned back toward the counter without looking at him. Damien's jaw tightened. She hadn't seen him. He made himself breathe. In through the nose, 3 counts. Out through the mouth, slow. The same technique his first handler had taught him when he was 19 and still learning to control the animal urgency that lived in his chest. He made his hands lie flat on the table. He made his face do the thing it knew how to do, arrange itself into the smooth, unreadable mask that had served him for 15 years across boardrooms and war councils and interrogation rooms and hospital corridors where men he'd sent there were dying. He made himself look at Victor Caruso and say, "You were saying something about the port arrangement." Victor was saying something about the port arrangement. Damien heard none of it. He knew her shape from 6 years ago. He knew the angle of her shoulders and the way her left hand always moved a half-second faster than her right, and the particular way she tilted her head when she was choosing her words carefully. He had studied her the way a man studies the only landscape he has ever truly felt located within. Not consciously, not deliberately, but with the body, with the cellular structure of attention that forms when a person becomes necessary to you in ways you cannot fully articulate. He had spent 2 years loving Nora Bennett, and then she had betrayed him, or so he had believed. The story he'd been given, by his Lieutenant Marco, by the evidence laid out in front of him that last terrible night 6 years ago, was clear. Nora had been passing information. Damien's movement schedules, the identities of key associates, the location of a secondary warehouse that had subsequently been raided. The raid had cost him 3 men, $200,000 in product, and the trust of an entire network he'd spent 4 years building. The evidence had Marco's fingerprints on it in the figurative sense, and Nora's in the literal. An encrypted file transfer, timestamps, a phone number registered to a shell corporation that led back to her. He had confronted her. She had denied it. He had not believed her denial. He had told her to leave the city and not come back. She had left. He had spent 6 months in a cold fury so clean and complete it had almost felt like healing. Then he had buried it entirely and rebuilt everything she had supposedly compromised. And the man who had loved Nora Bennett had become something he stopped being able to access, like a room in a house that had been locked from the inside. He had not thought about her in years. That was the story he told himself, anyway. The little boy came in from the back. He was maybe 5, maybe 6, with a gap between his front teeth and hair the color of dark coffee. I was carrying a small backpack that was clearly too big for him because one strap kept sliding off his shoulder, and he kept hiking it up with a gesture that was half irritated, half resigned. He wore small sneakers with the Velcro straps done up crookedly. He went directly behind the counter and climbed onto a stool and pulled a worn coloring book from the backpack and opened it with the serious concentration of a person who had places to be. Nora appeared from the back, said something to him quietly, and ruffled his hair. He ducked away from her hand with the particular exasperation of a child who loved his mother but had a professional image to maintain. The boy looked up. His eyes moved across the cafe with the incurious, comprehensive scan of a child checking his surroundings, the same way Damien's eyes moved across every room he entered. Threat assessment, exit mapping, cataloging. And for one fraction of a second those eyes, which were dark and direct and set beneath a strong bridged nose in a face still soft with childhood, landed on Damien. Damien felt the breath leave his body in a way that had nothing to do with training. He knew that face. Not the child's face. He had never met this child, but the structure underneath the softness, the architecture of it, that was Moretti bone. That was his grandfather's jaw and his own eyes, and something in the set of the brow that he had seen in photographs of himself at that age, formal portraits his mother had kept in a leather album that he'd looked at once after she died and then put away. The boy went back to his coloring book. Damien looked at his hands on the table. They were completely still. They were also, he observed this clinically, the way he might observe weather conditions, the hands of a man who was working very hard not to break something. Damien, Isabella's voice. Quiet, but with a particular inflection he recognized as the register she used when she thought he was losing focus. Victor asked you a question. He looked at Victor. I'm sorry, he said. His voice came out level. It always came out level. What was the question? Victor studied him for a moment with old, careful eyes. Then, I asked whether you'd reviewed the new transit terms. Yes, Damien said. I have questions about the northern corridor, but they can wait until after lunch. Victor nodded, apparently satisfied. Damien picked up his coffee. His hands did not shake. For the next 40 minutes, Damien Moretti conducted himself with the precision of a man diffusing a device in the dark. He answered Victor's questions. He made counteroffers on 2 points of the transit agreement. He ate the food that arrived at the table, a short pasta, bread, something with olives, without tasting any of it. He spoke to Isabella 3 times, briefly, on topics he could not later recall. And he watched Nora. Not directly. He had spent too many years in rooms where being caught watching something important could get you killed. He watched her in the reflective surfaces, the chrome coffee machine behind the counter, the plate glass window, the polished edge of the napkin holder on the table. He watched the way she moved between the four occupied tables, the economy of her motion, the quiet efficiency of it, the way she smiled at an elderly couple near the window. Not the full smile he remembered, the one that started slow and then broke open like something surprised by its own warmth, but something smaller, more managed, a smile that had learned to cost less. She was thinner than she'd been. Not unhealthy, but thinned in the way that people get when life runs them at a deficit for a long time. There were new lines at the corners of her eyes. Her hands, when they moved over the table surfaces, collecting cups, setting down plates, were capable and economical and told a story of years of physical work. She had not looked at him once. He couldn't decide whether this was because she hadn't recognized him, which seemed impossible, though the table was near the back and the lighting in the cafe was soft and she'd been busy, or because she had recognized him and was performing the same elaborate, controlled theater he was. The third possibility, that she had recognized him and simply felt nothing, he set aside without examining it. At 12:47, Victor Caruso stood and excused himself to use the restroom. Isabella turned to Damien and said quietly, "Who is she?" He looked at his fiancée. Her expression was not jealous. Isabella Romano did not do jealousy, the same way she didn't do sentimentality or hesitation. It was something more like professional assessment. "No one," he said. Isabella looked at him for a moment, the way she looked at balance sheets when something didn't add up, and then looked back at the counter. "She keeps not looking at you," Isabella said. "People who are no one don't make a point of not looking." Damien said nothing. "Also," Isabella said, dropping her voice another half register, "the boy behind the counter. What about him?" "He has your nose," she paused, "and your eyes." Damien turned his coffee cup 90 degrees on the table. It was a thing he did when he needed his hands to have something small to do. "Isabella," he said. "I'm not asking for your confession," she said, with the precise, bloodless efficiency that he genuinely respected about her. "I'm making an observation. As your future partner, I think you should know that it's an observation other people are capable of making." Victor came back from the restroom, and the conversation became about transit routes again, and Damien sat inside his own chest like a man inside a house that had just been struck by lightning, everything still standing, but every load-bearing element suddenly uncertain. They left at 2:15. He held the door for Isabella. He walked to the car. He got in. He said to Carmine, his driver, "Give me 20 minutes." Carmine didn't ask. Carmine never asked. Damien sat in the back seat of the car and stared at the brick wall of the building across the street, and let himself, for the first time in 6 years, think about what he had just seen. Nora. Alive, which he had always known, because he had always known where she was in the general sense. Not tracking her, not watching her, but the way a man with his resources always has a passive awareness of the people who have mattered to him, a quiet background signal. She had moved out of the city for 3 years, then come back. She had been working at Café Solène for 14 months. He had never come to this part of the city. Now he thought about why that was. The boy. 5, maybe 6. Dark hair, strong-bridged nose, his grandmother's jaw in a child's face. A backpack too big for his shoulders. Velcro sneakers done up crookedly. A coloring book opened with the seriousness of someone who had a professional image to maintain. He pulled his phone out and held it. Then he put it back in his pocket. "Carmine," he said. "Sir?" "The cafe we just left. Café Solène. I want to know everything about it. The ownership, the staff, the lease arrangement. I want background on a woman named Nora Bennett. She may be using a different name. I want it clean, and I want it thorough, and I want it in 24 hours. A pause. "And Carmine." "Sir." "Nobody else hears about this. Not Marco. Not anybody." "Understood." Damien looked out the window at the quiet street, the ordinary afternoon, the unremarkable life moving past the car on both sides. He thought, she was passing information. I thought, that boy is 6, at most. He thought, I told her to leave. She left. She was pregnant when she left. He thought, Marco laid out that evidence very carefully, very specifically, very completely. He thought about the raid on the warehouse. He thought about the 3 men who had died in it. He thought about how Marco had been the one who discovered the breach, how Marco had brought the evidence to him, how Marco had stood beside him when he'd confronted Nora and told her to go. He thought, Marco was the only other person who knew the warehouse location. He had thought this before. He had thought this 7 months after Nora left, lying awake at 3 in the morning, and he had looked at the thought from every angle, and then he had stood up and gone to the window and made himself put it away. Because to follow that thought to its conclusion meant accepting that he had destroyed the one thing in his life that had not been made of calculation, and he wasn't ready to survive that. He still might not be ready. But the boy in the cafe had his grandmother's jaw. "Take me home," Damien said. He did not sleep. He stood on the terrace of his apartment for 4 hours in the dark, which was something he did when he needed to think without the apartment around him, which sometimes felt like a museum of the man he had arranged himself to be. The city below was its ordinary nighttime self, light and traffic, and the low murmur of a place that never fully quieted. He'd grown up 6 miles from here, in a house that smelled of cigarette smoke and pasta and something metallic that he'd only later understood was the presence of threat. The Moretti name had meant something even then, but what it meant was complicated and heavy and passed down to him without his consent. He thought about Nora the way he had taught himself not to think about her, directly. He thought about the afternoon 2 weeks before the raid when she had asked him, very quietly, sitting across from him in the kitchen of his apartment with both hands around a coffee mug, whether there was ever going to be a version of his life that didn't run on fear and proximity to violence. He had not answered her directly. He had said something evasive, and she had looked at him with those clear, patient eyes and nodded once, the way she nodded when she had received the information she needed and was deciding what to do with it. He thought about what she must have decided. He thought about what she must have found out, must have known, or suspected, about her own situation in the weeks that followed, and what it must have been like to stand in front of him and hear him tell her she was a traitor, and to get out of his city, knowing what she was carrying, knowing she couldn't prove anything, knowing his mind was made up because Marco had made it up for him before he'd ever walked into the room. He stood on the terrace for 4 hours. When the first light came, he went inside and sat at his desk and opened his laptop and looked at the files Marco had given him 6 years ago, which he had kept because he kept everything. He looked at them for a long time with new eyes, and what he saw was not what he had seen at 32, with the fury still fresh in him. What he saw now was the work of a careful man who had known exactly what he was building and had built it with the specific architectural precision of someone constructing a room designed to have no exits. At 6:17 in the morning, his phone buzzed. It was Carmine, with the beginnings of what he'd asked for. Nora Bennett, current name unchanged, Café Solène, part-time waitress, 14 months. Also working 3 nights a week at a laundromat on Kellner Street. The cafe owner was a woman named Deb Troutman, who had no criminal connections and had given Nora a job, apparently, as a personal favor of some kind. Nora's apartment, a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a walk-up on Prescott. Her utilities were consistent with someone who paid them on time, but not easily. No car. Bus pass. The boy, Emilio Bennett, called Milo. Age 6. Enrolled in 1st grade at Calvert Elementary. Medical records required a warrant to access, which Damien was not going to apply for, but there were other ways. He sat with all of this for a long time. 14 months back in the city. No contact, no request for anything. Living in a 1-bedroom on Prescott with a 6-year-old boy, working 2 jobs, riding the bus. She hadn't come to him. He didn't know what to do with that. Whether it was pride or fear or a decision she'd made about what was good for the boy, for Milo, or whether, after everything, she simply didn't want him anywhere near her or her child. Her child. He made himself say it properly, in his own head, which was the only place he allowed himself to say things properly. His child. Damien Moretti, who had built an empire on the principle that he never left variables uncontrolled, sat in his study in the early morning light and understood that he had allowed the biggest variable of his life to live 3 miles away from him in a walk-up apartment for the past 14 months, because some part of him had known, had always known, that looking directly at this particular truth was going to cost him more than he had previously been willing to pay. He closed the files. He opened them again. He picked up his phone and called Marco's number. Marco answered on the 2nd ring, which he always did, with the particular alertness of a man who had spent decades waiting for the call he deserved. "Morning," Marco said. "Clear your afternoon," Damien said. "There are some files I want to go over with you." A pause. Brief, possibly undetectable to anyone who didn't know Marco the way Damien knew Marco. "Of course," Marco said. "Which files?" "Old ones," Damien said. "The Bennett situation." Another pause. "I'll be there at 3, Marco said. Damien hung up. He sat for another moment in the early quiet of the apartment. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and went downstairs to the car. "Prescott Street," he told Carmine. "The block between 8th and the crossing. Park on the south side." He didn't say why. He didn't need to. He sat in the back of the car as it moved through the waking city and told himself he was going to assess the situation from a distance. He told himself this was reconnaissance. He told himself the fact that his chest felt like a man was pressing a hand flat against it from the inside was irrelevant information that he was capable of setting aside. They parked. At 7:40, the door of the walk-up opened and Nora came out with the boy, with Milo, who was wearing the same too big backpack as yesterday, this time with both straps on his shoulders, buckled across the chest, with the kind of determination that belongs to small people who have been told something is important and have decided to take it seriously. Nora had her hair down today. She was wearing a dark coat that was slightly too large for her, a man's coat, or a coat she'd bought secondhand, and she was carrying a canvas bag on one shoulder and saying something to Milo that made him respond with an expression of theatrical outrage that was so specifically, precisely, a Moretti expression that Damien felt it in his sternum like a struck note. They went down the steps together, Nora's hand briefly on Milo's shoulder at the bottom, and then walked in the direction of the bus stop. Damien watched until they turned the corner. He sat in the car for another 2 minutes without speaking. "Carmine," he said finally. "Sir, I need you to pull the full file on Marco Vitale. Everything from the beginning, every transaction, every outside contact, every movement in the 6 months before the Bennett situation and the 6 months after." The silence in the car was the particular silence of a man who understood that something was shifting at the foundations. "Yes, sir," Carmine said. Damien looked at the corner where Nora and Milo had disappeared. The boy had his grandmother's jaw and his eyes, and walked with the kind of serious, deliberate step that a small person develops when they have decided the world is something to be moved through with intention. He was 6 years old. Damien had been told to choose, once, between love and empire. He had chosen empire because he believed love had betrayed him first. He was beginning to understand that what he had actually chosen was a lie, constructed by a man who had decided Damien's love made him controllable, and had built a careful room around it with no exits, and had watched Damien walk in and close the door behind himself. The car moved away from the curb. 3 miles away, in a walk-up on Prescott, the apartment that Nora Bennett had been living in for 14 months held whatever she had managed to build in the space between being destroyed and continuing. His phone buzzed again. Isabella, about a dinner with her father, about the wedding timeline, about something that he read and did not absorb. He thought about the file he would review with Marco at 3. He thought about the particular, careful quality of Marco's pauses on the phone this morning. He thought about a 6-year-old boy with a backpack buckled across his chest, walking toward a bus stop with his mother, who had not once looked back. I was back in his office by 9. By noon, Carmine had placed 4 sealed folders on the desk without being asked to explain why they were sealed or what was in them. By 1:30, Damien had read each of them twice. By 2:45, he was standing at the window of his office with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the city, and what he was feeling was not anger in any form he recognized. It was colder than anger, denser. It had the quality of certainty, which in his experience was always the most dangerous emotion available to him, because anger could be managed, could be redirected, could be spent. Certainty tended to produce decisions that could not be walked back. The evidence against Marco was not explosive. It was not a single revealing document or a caught phone call. It was 17 small things accumulated, a pattern of timing, a series of outside contacts who mapped to a rival family's network, a financial trail that required 3 degrees of separation to follow, but led, eventually and without ambiguity, to a set of transactions that had occurred in the 48 hours before the warehouse raid. Before Marco had brought Damien the evidence about Nora. Before everything. Damien had missed it 6 years ago because he'd been too angry and because Marco had given him a direction to point the anger, and he had pointed it. He was very good at pointing anger. At 2:58, Marco knocked on the office door. "Come in," Damien said. Marco Vitale was 53, compact, with gray at his temples, and the kind of face that inspired trust in people who didn't know better. Open, attentive, the face of a man who was genuinely listening to you, who had your interests at heart. Damien had trusted that face for 12 years. He had trusted it completely. Marco stepped into the office and looked at the folders on the desk. Nothing crossed his face. Nothing was there to cross. "Sit down," Damien said. Marco sat. Damien remained standing at the window. "Tell me what you remember," Damien said, "about the Bennett situation, 6 years ago. Take me through it from the beginning." Marco laced his hands on the desk. Not on his own desk, but Damien's, which meant he'd made himself at home in a space that wasn't his, and had done it automatically, which meant it was habitual, and looked at Damien with that open, attentive face. "We've been over this," Marco said. "I thought we were done with it." "We're going over it again," Damien said. "From the beginning." A beat. "The tip came from a source inside the DeLuca operation," Marco said. "They had documentation of a file transfer from a device registered to—" "Who was the source?" Damien said. "I told you at the time, I protected the source for operational—" "Marco." Damien turned from the window. "I'm going to ask you one more time, cleanly, and I want you to think very carefully about your answer. Who was the source who provided the documentation on Nora Bennett?" The room was very quiet. Marco looked at Damien's face, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not guilt, exactly. Not fear, exactly. But the specific recalibration of a man who has been operating under the assumption that a door was closed and has just realized it may have been open for some time. "Damien," he said, "whatever you think you found—" "The name," Damien said. Marco was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "You were getting soft. She was making you soft. A man in your position cannot afford—" Damien held up one hand and Marco stopped speaking. The hand came down. "Get out of my office," Damien said. His voice was level. It was always level. This was, he understood, the most frightening version of him. Not the one who shouted, not the one who lost control, but the one who was absolutely, glacially still and asked you to leave. Marco rose from the chair. "Don't leave the city," Damien said. Marco left. Damien stood in the office alone for a moment, in the particular silence that follows the death of something that had been wrong for a very long time and is now, at last, correctly named. Then he pulled out his phone. He looked at Nora's address, which Carmine had sent him at 6:17 that morning. He thought about walking up to a door on Prescott Street. He thought about the look on her face. He thought about what words existed in the English language that could carry what he needed to say to her. What sequence of sounds could possibly constitute adequate? Not apology, which was too small, not explanation, which was too late, but acknowledgement, maybe, of the specific size of what he had done and what it had cost her. He thought about the boy with the backpack buckled across his chest, walking toward the bus stop, with the careful step of a small person who had decided the world was something to be moved through with intention. He put the phone in his pocket. He put on his jacket. And then his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, which was unusual. Very few numbers he didn't recognize made it through his screening. His jaw tightened slightly as he answered. "Moretti," he said. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, with the specific quality of calm that belongs to men who are calm because they have already decided how things are going to go. "Mr. Moretti," the voice said, "this is a courtesy call. We know about the woman at the cafe. We know about the boy. And we want you to know that we know." Damien's hand was completely still on the phone. "We'll be in touch," the voice said, "about next steps." The call ended. Damien stood in his office in the sudden new silence and understood, with the comprehensive, instantaneous clarity of a man who has spent 15 years reading the geometry of threats, that something had just changed. The piece he had not known was on the board had just been picked up by a hand he hadn't seen, and it was not Nora's safety that was the issue now. It was that whoever had just called him had done so because they knew the sight of that boy would make Damien Moretti, the most feared man in the city, into something vulnerable. They were right, and they were going to use it. Damien stood in his office for 11 seconds after the call ended. He knew it was 11 seconds because he counted them. An old habit, the kind that forms when you spend enough years in situations where the difference between a controlled response and a catastrophic one is measured in the time it takes a man to decide who he's going to be in the next 30 seconds. He counted to 11, and then he moved. He called Carmine first. The cafe. Café Solène. Put two men on the block. Unmarked. I want eyes on the woman and the boy. I want them there in the next 20 minutes, and I don't want anyone to know they're there. Not Marco. Not anyone from the inner structure. Understood. And if someone approaches them? Nobody approaches them, Damien said. Nobody gets within 20 feet of them. If that changes, you call me before you do anything else. He hung up. He stood at the window of his office and looked at the city below him. The ordinary afternoon of it, the traffic and the pedestrians and the indifferent light, and tried to determine what he actually knew versus what he was inferring. What he knew, someone had his personal number. Someone knew about Nora, about Milo, about the connection. Someone had been watching either him or Café Solène or both, and had concluded that the boy was a lever. They had called to announce this rather than to simply use it, which meant one of two things. Either they wanted something and were opening a negotiation, or they wanted him to panic and make a mistake, and the call itself was the move. What he inferred, this was not random. The timing was too precise. He had been in that cafe for the first time yesterday, and by today there was already a phone call, which meant either he had been followed, possible, though his security arrangements made it improbable, or someone inside his organization had flagged his movement to an outside party. Marco. He didn't know if Marco was acting alone or as part of something larger. He didn't know if yesterday's meeting at Café Solène had been Victor Caruso's suggestion or Marco's suggestion filtered through Victor Caruso. He didn't know yet how deep the rot went. What he did know was that he needed to get to Nora before whoever had made that call decided that negotiation was taking too long. He was already moving toward the door when his phone buzzed again. Isabella this time, a message rather than a call. My father wants to move the timeline up. He's suggesting we finalize the remaining terms this week rather than waiting. Dinner tomorrow. His house. Confirm. Damien looked at the message. He thought about what it meant that Victor Caruso wanted to accelerate the timeline on the day after Damien had sat across from him in a cafe and identified a vulnerability. He thought about old, careful eyes and a handshake that measured grip for grip. He typed back, confirmed. Then he put the phone in his jacket and went downstairs. Café Solène was quiet at 3 in the afternoon. The lunch crowd had cleared and the pre-dinner gap had settled over the place like a held breath. 2 tables occupied. A couple near the window sharing something neither of them was eating. An older man in a canvas jacket working through a newspaper with the methodical attention of someone who was not in a hurry to be anywhere else. The ceiling fan turned overhead. The espresso machine behind the counter produced a sound like a controlled exhale. Nora was wiping down the counter when Damien walked in. She saw him immediately. He knew this because her hand stopped moving, a half-second freeze, the cloth going still on the counter surface, and then resumed, deliberate and controlled, and she did not look up. He crossed the cafe and sat down at the counter. He didn't sit at a table. Tables implied that she could choose whether or not to come to him. Sitting at the counter meant she was going to have to deal with him in the next 30 seconds, whether she wanted to or not. She took 3 more passes at the counter surface. Then she put the cloth down and looked at him. 6 years. He had prepared himself in the car on the way over for what 6 years would look like on a face he'd once known so specifically he could have described it in the dark. He had prepared himself for anger, for the specific cold fury of a woman who has been badly wronged and has had time to calcify around it. He had prepared himself, if he was honest, for something that resembled hatred, because he thought he'd earned that. What he hadn't prepared himself for was the look she was actually giving him, which was not hatred and not anger and not cold fury. It was something more exhausting than any of those things. It was the expression of someone who has already processed the hardest version of this moment 1,000 times in their head, in the dark, in the small hours of one-bedroom apartments, and has arrived on the other side of it, not at peace exactly, but at something like resignation. The specific resignation of a person who has accepted that the worst thing has already happened and is still, somehow, continuing to happen. Nora, he said. I'm working, she said. Her voice was level. Quieter than he remembered, but level. I know, he said. I need 5 minutes. I don't have 5 minutes. Nora. He kept his voice low, kept it even, kept it clear of the thing that was pushing against the inside of his chest like a hand trying to find a door. There are people watching this cafe, right now, today. They're not my people. I have my people here too, to make sure those people don't do anything, but I need you to understand that your situation has changed in the last 24 hours, and I need to talk to you somewhere that isn't here. She looked at him. He watched her process this, watched the way her jaw tightened and her eyes moved, briefly, to the back of the cafe where Milo was presumably doing whatever Milo did in the afternoons, and then came back to him. "You have some nerve," she said very quietly. "Yes," he said. "I know. Coming in here." "Yes." "To my job." "Yes." She looked at him for another long moment with those clear, patient eyes that were older now and carried more in them than they used to, and he held the look without flinching, because this was the least he could do, hold the look without flinching. "5 minutes," she said, "in the back. And you better say something worth my time." The back of the cafe was a narrow space between the kitchen and the storage room, a hallway, essentially, with a plastic chair and a row of coat hooks and a small window that looked out on the alley behind the building. Nora stood with her back to the window and her arms crossed and her chin lifted at the precise angle that he remembered meant she was holding herself together by specific, deliberate effort. He told her, in 4 sentences, what had happened, the phone call, the voice, what they'd said, and what it meant. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. "How long have you known?" she said. "About Milo." "Yesterday," he said. "I didn't know until I saw him." "You didn't know." Her voice was flat. Not disbelieving exactly, more like someone confirming a piece of information they'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. "You didn't know because you told me to get out, and you didn't look back." "Yes," he said. She breathed through her nose, in and out, once. "And now that you know," she said, "you walked into my cafe and sat down at my counter in the middle of my workday to tell me that people are watching this building, which is what exactly? That's supposed to be what? You coming to help?" "It's information you need," he said. "Whatever you think of me, what I think of you." She laughed once, short and dry, a sound with no warmth in it at all. "Damien, 6 years ago you looked me in the face and told me I was a traitor. You told me I had sold you out. You had your guy, Marco, standing right there with a folder of evidence that you were absolutely certain about, and you told me to get out of the city and not come back, and I was—" She stopped. "I know," he said. "You don't get to say I know," she said. "You don't get that. I was pregnant. I was standing in front of you trying to tell you I didn't do it, and I was pregnant, and you didn't believe me, and you sent me away." He absorbed this. He let it sit in him the way it needed to sit, without deflecting it, without reaching for explanation or context, or the mitigating factors that existed, and were real, and were also, at this moment, completely beside the point. "I know," he said again, "because it was the only thing that was honest. Stop saying that. What do you want me to say?" "Nothing." She pressed the heel of her hand briefly to her forehead. "I want you to say nothing and be nowhere and leave me and my son alone, which is what I built my entire life around for the past 6 years, and now you're standing in my hallway telling me it's not possible anymore." "Nora, is it Marco?" Her eyes came back to him, sharp and direct. "The evidence. Was it him?" The question landed without preamble, and he understood, from the way she asked it, the specific precision of it, the lack of surprise, that she had suspected this for a long time, that maybe she had known it and simply had no way to make it matter. "I believe so," he said. She breathed. "I believe so," she repeated. The words came out stripped of inflection. 6 years. Milo doesn't have a father. I've been working 2 jobs for 3 years. I moved back here 14 months ago because I ran out of options, and this was the only city I knew well enough to build something in, and I chose this neighborhood specifically because I thought you would never come to this part of the city." She paused. "And here you are." "Here I am," he said. "I need you to be very clear with me," she said. "These people watching the cafe, how serious is this?" "Serious enough that I came here myself instead of sending someone." "How much time do we have?" "I don't know yet. The call was a warning. That means they want something first before they act. But I don't know what, and I don't know the timeline." She unfolded her arms, then refolded them, then dropped them to her sides entirely. A sequence of small adjustments that he recognized as the physical grammar of someone managing a feeling they haven't decided how to categorize yet. I have to get Milo from school at 3:40, she said. I know, he said. I'll have someone with you. No, she said immediately. Nora, I am not walking into his school with one of your men. He's 6. He doesn't know what his life is connected to, and I have worked very hard to keep it that way. Then I'll be discreet. Discreet. She looked at him with something in her eyes that was not quite contempt, not quite sorrow. Somewhere between the two, in the territory of things that are too tired to fully become either. You sat in my cafe for 40 minutes yesterday with your fiancée and the head of the Caruso family, and you think discreet is still something available to us. He said nothing. I need to think, she said. I need you to give me time to think. You have until 3:40, he said. That's what I can give you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, and with a kind of precision that cut differently than anger, I want you to know that I don't need you. I want that said clearly. Whatever happens next, whatever arrangement we make, because apparently we don't have a choice, I don't need you. And I don't want Milo to need you, because the last time I let myself need you, it cost me everything. Are we clear? We're clear, he said. She turned back toward the cafe. Wait, he said. She stopped but didn't turn. I'm going to deal with Marco, he said, and I'm going to find out who made that call, and I'm going to make sure nothing gets near you or him. He paused. I know that doesn't... Don't, she said. Don't tell me what it does or doesn't fix. Just do it or don't do it. She pushed through the back door into the cafe and didn't look at him again. Oh, he sat in the car outside for 6 minutes. Then Carmine said, from the front seat, Sir, we may have a problem. Talk. The 2 men I put on the block, they've identified a vehicle, gray sedan, changed positions twice in the last hour. 2 occupants. They're not ours. Plates? Shell registration. But the style is Ferrante. Damien was quiet for a moment. The Ferrante family was not a name he'd expected. They were not a major power. A mid-tier organization, ambitious and aggressive, with a history of taking runs at operations they couldn't sustain. They had been making noise in the eastern part of the city for 8 months, encroaching on distribution networks, testing responses. Damien had not yet responded, because you didn't use a sledgehammer to close a window, and he had been waiting for them to either retreat or overreach. They had apparently decided on overreach. Keep our men in position, he said. Don't engage. If the sedan moves toward the cafe, I want to know the second it moves. He pulled out his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 4 years. It rang twice. Moretti, said the voice on the other end. Rino Ferrante, 3rd generation, 38 years old, the kind of confident that comes from never having actually lost anything yet. I was wondering when you'd call. I'm going to ask you one question, Damien said, and I want an honest answer because I will know if it isn't. Sure, Reno said with the ease of a man who didn't yet understand his position. Was it you who called me this morning? A beat. Then, I don't know what you're talking about. Wrong answer, Damien said. Moretti, you put people on my personal contact. You identified a civilian and a child, and you called me to announce it. His voice was still level. He was very good at level. Here's what I want you to understand. Whatever you thought that was going to accomplish, whatever leverage you thought you were building, you've made a mistake of a very specific kind, the kind a man doesn't usually get to explain afterward. The silence on the other end was longer this time. This is the only call, Damien said. Pull your men off the block. Don't make me tell you again. He hung up. He looked out the window at the street. Carmine, he said. Sir. The sedan. If it's still on the block in 20 minutes, I want to know. 17 minutes later, Carmine said, Sedan's gone. Damien exhaled slowly. That was the easy part. The Ferrante threat was real but manageable. Reno was ambitious, but he was not suicidal, and a direct call from Damien Moretti carried enough weight to produce a tactical retreat. But the threat itself existing meant the information had come from somewhere. Reno Ferrante did not have the infrastructure to monitor Damien's movements independently. Someone had given him the cafe. Someone had given him Nora's name and the connection. Marco had given him 9 minutes of careful, neutral conversation before Damien had dismissed him, and in those 9 minutes, Marco had said nothing useful and looked at nothing telling. But Marco was good. Marco had always been good, and Marco had been managing information flows for 12 years with the same hands that had built the false case against Nora. And if Marco had decided, in the 36 hours since Damien had been in the cafe, that the Bennett situation was becoming a liability, if Marco had decided that feeding something to Ferrante would create enough chaos to redirect Damien's attention away from the old files, then this was not a threat from outside. This was Marco lighting a fire in the house and standing outside to watch. Dinner at the Caruso house was at 7. Victor Caruso's home was the kind of house that communicated its owner's nature without requiring explanation. A wide brick Georgian in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of neighborhood that had been expensive for so long it had stopped needing to announce it. The interior was dark wood and good furniture and the specific quality of silence that belongs to rooms where serious things have been decided. Victor met him at the door himself. Isabella was already inside. 3 of Victor's men were visible, and a 4th was positioned somewhere Damien couldn't immediately locate, which was intentional. A reminder, offered with complete courtesy, of whose house this was. The dining room table seated 12. There were 3 place settings. The first 40 minutes were the specific choreography of powerful men conducting normal social interaction: food, wine, controlled pleasantries about the city and the season, and a mutual acquaintance in the shipping industry. Victor was warm in the way that men from old money violence tended to be warm, expansive on the surface, meticulous underneath. Then the plates were cleared and Victor settled back in his chair and folded his hands on the table, and the choreography shifted. "I heard you had an interesting afternoon," Victor said. Damien looked at him. "I have many interesting afternoons," Damien said. "The Ferrante business," Victor said. "I heard Reno was poking around one of your properties." "It was handled," Damien said. "Of course it was." Victor studied him. "I also heard something else. A woman. A child." He paused. "I'm not in the business of judging a man's personal history, Damien. Lord knows mine has chapters I don't read aloud. But I am in the business of alliances, and I would find it useful to understand whether this situation is going to become complicated." Isabella, beside her father, was looking at the table. "It's not your business," Damien said. Victor's expression didn't change. "My daughter is marrying you in 4 months," he said. "That makes everything your business, my business. The situation is under control." "Is it?" Victor reached for his wine glass. He didn't drink from it, he just held it. "Because what I'm hearing, from multiple sources, which I find notable, is that the Ferrante family has become interested in a woman who has a connection to you. And I'm wondering whether that connection is the kind that creates operational vulnerabilities." He set the glass down. "I'm not asking because I want to interfere. I'm asking because if there is a vulnerability, I need to know it exists so I can be sure it doesn't affect what we're building." Damien looked at Victor Caruso across the width of the table, at the old, careful eyes and the folded hands and the controlled warmth, and understood something in the space of that look that he had been circling around for 2 days. Victor Caruso had been the one to suggest Café Solène. Victor Caruso had been the one to choose the location, the date, the time. Victor Caruso had known who worked there. He didn't show it on his face. He made his face do the thing it knew how to do and said calmly, "There is no operational vulnerability. The situation with the Ferrante family was a miscalculation on their part, and it's been corrected." "Good," Victor said, and smiled. The smile was gracious and even warm in its particular construction, and it told Damien absolutely nothing about what was underneath it, which was itself a kind of information. He drove home at 10:15. He sat in the back of the car without speaking. In the space between the Caruso house and his apartment, he built the picture. Not the complete picture, he was missing too many pieces for that, but enough of the outline to understand the shape of what he was standing inside. Marco, feeding information. Victor, positioning him. The Ferrante threat, possibly coordinated, possibly independent, but used by someone, Marco or Victor, or both, as a pressure point. The meeting at Café Solène, deliberately arranged so Damien would see Nora, would see the boy, would be destabilized. And the wedding alliance, the multifamily merger that had been 5 years in the building, an arrangement that Damien was beginning to understand was not designed to give him power, but to put him inside a structure where his power could be managed. All of it built around one calculation, that Damien Moretti, upon discovering he had a son, would become something controllable. They weren't wrong about the son. They were wrong about what it would make him. His phone buzzed at 10:40 as the car turned onto his block. The number was Nora's, a number Carmine had pulled from the cafe records and sent him that morning without being asked, because Carmine understood his job with the specific, wordless fluency of someone who had been doing it for a long time. He answered. Nora's voice was tight and fast and stripped of everything except the specific quality of a person transmitting urgent information with as few words as possible. Someone followed me home from the school. Gray car, 2 men. I went inside and locked the door, but they're still on the street. I have Milo. He doesn't know. I need you to tell me right now what I'm supposed to do. The gray sedan. Damien's jaw set. Reno Ferrante had pulled off the cafe block this afternoon. He had not pulled off Nora. Stay inside, he said. Do not open the door. I'll have men there in 8 minutes. Damien, 8 minutes, he said. Lock the door and stay away from the windows. He pulled the phone from his ear and said to Carmine, Prescott Street, now. The car accelerated. Damien looked out at the moving city, and inside his chest, the cold, dense certainty he had felt in his office that morning reorganized itself around a new center. Not Marco, not Victor, not the architecture of betrayal he'd been building a case against for 2 days, but the specific, undeniable, non-negotiable fact of Nora's voice on the phone, saying, I have Milo, in the tone of a woman who is trying very hard not to be frightened in front of her child. He was not going to let this stand. Whatever it cost, the alliance, the wedding, the empire that Marco and Victor had apparently decided to use as a cage, he was not going to let this stand. The car turned onto Prescott Street, and the gray sedan was exactly where Nora had described it, engine running, 2 shapes visible through the glass, and the walk-up at the end of the block had 1 light on in a 3rd-floor window. And behind that light was his son, who did not know what his life was connected to, and a woman who had spent 6 years building something in the space between being destroyed and continuing. Stop here, Damien said. He got out of the car. He started walking toward the sedan, and his face was completely still, and the 2 men inside it looked up and saw him coming and had exactly enough time to understand that Reno Ferrante had made a very serious miscalculation before Damien reached the driver's window and made his position on the matter absolutely clear. The 2 men in the sedan were not soldiers. Damien understood this the moment he got close enough to see their faces through the glass. The particular quality of unease that belonged to men who had been given an assignment that exceeded their actual experience. They were watchers, not fighters. Someone had sent observers, not a strike team, still deciding how far he wanted to push. Damien reached the driver's window and stood there. The driver, 20-something, a thin jaw, sweat already visible at his collar despite the cool of the evening, looked up at him with the expression of a man who had just understood that the thing he'd been told to do was considerably more dangerous than advertised. Damien said nothing for 4 seconds. Then, roll it down. The window came down. You're going to call Reno, Damien said. Right now. You're going to tell him that Damien Moretti is standing next to your car, and you're going to put the phone on speaker so I can hear his response. The driver's hand was already moving toward his phone with the reflexive compliance of someone whose body had made the decision before his brain finished processing the situation. The call connected on the 2nd ring. What? Reno said. The driver said, He's here. His voice came out thinner than he'd probably intended. A pause on the line, then, put him on. Damien took the phone. He didn't put it to his ear. He held it at chest level so his voice would carry clearly and said, Last time we spoke, I told you to pull your men. You pulled the ones at the cafe. You left these 2. Reno's voice came back with the specific, careful quality of a man recalibrating. I didn't think the woman's building counted as your property. She has a child, Damien said. You put men outside a building where a child lives. I want you to sit with what that means for 30 seconds before you say anything else. The pause that followed was longer than 30 seconds. They weren't going to do anything, Reno said. It was surveillance. Surveillance of a civilian and a 6-year-old boy, Damien said, for the purpose of using them as leverage against me. He let that sit for a moment. I'm going to ask you one question, Reno. The honest answer saves you significant difficulty. Who gave you Nora Bennett's name? Another pause. We found it ourselves, Reno said. Wrong answer, Damien said, and handed the phone back to the driver. Tell your employer that the next time I see his men in this neighborhood, I won't be making phone calls. He stepped back from the car. He watched it pull away from the curb, slow and careful, like a man backing out of a room he'd entered incorrectly. Then he turned toward the walk-up. Nora opened the door before he could knock, which meant she'd been watching from somewhere near the window despite being told to stay away from it, and he decided not to say anything about this because she had the look of a woman who had been managing her own survival for long enough that she didn't need his instructions about basic security protocols. She stepped back to let him in. The apartment was small and very clean, the particular cleanliness of a space where someone had worked hard to make limited square footage feel intentional. A dark blue throw across the couch, a line of Milo's drawings taped to the kitchen wall at child height, two small bookshelves packed with an accumulation that told a story of years of reading as the cheapest available escape. The window above the kitchen sink had a crack along the lower corner sealed with weather-strip tape. The radiator in the corner was the old kind, cast iron, that clanked. Milo was at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and a library book open beside it, reading with the focused inattention of a child who is pretending not to be aware of adult tension in the room. Damien stopped in the entryway. He had seen his son at a distance twice. Here, 6 feet away in the specific ordinary light of a kitchen on a Tuesday evening, the boy was… He didn't have words for it, not the ones that could carry the actual weight of what it was to stand here. Milo had the book angled toward the light with one hand and the spoon in the other, and his shoulders were slightly hunched with the concentration of reading, and his hair was doing the specific thing that Damien's own hair did in the morning before it was dealt with. A tendency to push left at the crown that no amount of effort fully corrected. He looked away. Nora had positioned herself between him and Milo with the instinctive, absolute precision of a mother who had decided the geometry of the room, and he respected this completely. "The car?" she said quietly. "Gone," he said. "For tonight." "For tonight," she repeated. "I need to deal with some things. It's going to take a day, maybe 2. I want to move you somewhere safer in the meantime." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not taking Milo out of school because…" "I know," he said. "I'm not suggesting that. I mean overnight. A hotel, somewhere out of this building, just for tonight." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Milo, who was still reading with pointed determination, and then back at Damien. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. He waited in the entryway while she packed a bag and spoke to Milo in a voice pitched too low for him to hear the words. Though he caught the boy's response, a single clear "why," with the upward inflection of a child who has decided to accept an explanation but wants it logged for the record that they are accepting it under mild protest. He heard Nora say something brief and matter-of-fact, and then the boy's chair scraped back and there were small sneakered footsteps. And then Milo appeared in the entryway doorway and looked directly at Damien. The look lasted 3 seconds. "You were at the cafe," Milo said. Not a question, a statement. The boy had his mother's eyes for detail. "Yes," Damien said. "You were sitting in the back." "Yes." Milo considered this with the seriousness he apparently brought to most things. "Mom doesn't usually bring people home," he said. "I know," Damien said. "I'm just going to make sure you get somewhere safe tonight." Another 3-second assessment. Then Milo said, "Okay," with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who has decided the situation is being handled by competent adults, and he can return his attention to other matters, and went back for his backpack and his library book. Damien stood in the entryway and made sure his face was doing what it was supposed to be doing. It was working very hard. Han put them in a hotel on the north side, a clean mid-range place, unremarkable, the kind that had good locks and bad carpets and asked no questions. He had Carmine's man on the floor, another in the lobby, and he did not tell Nora about either of them because she would have objected, and she was not wrong to object, and the security was happening anyway. He drove back to his apartment at midnight. At 12:40, Marco Vitale called him. He let it ring, twice. Then he answered. "I heard there was an incident on Prescott Street," Marco said. "News travels fast," Damien said. "I have ears everywhere, you know that." A pause. "You should have told me about the woman, Damien. I could have helped manage this." "I don't need your help managing it." "The Fiancée situation is going to escalate," Marco said. Reno isn't going to back down because you scared two of his guys. He's going to push harder, and when he does, you want a unified front, not a distracted one. I appreciate the strategic input, Damien said. I'll be in touch. He hung up. He sat at his desk with the phone in his hand and looked at the wall. Marco had heard about Prescott Street in 3 hours. That was too fast for organic intelligence. Marco had a source on Damien's immediate security, on someone in Carmine's rotation, or on the hotel arrangement, or on something even closer than that. He thought, I told Carmine where they were going. He thought, Carmine has been with me for 9 years. He thought, Marco has been with me for 12. He made himself stop building that particular structure because it led somewhere he wasn't ready to go tonight, and instead opened the files on his laptop and worked until 3 in the morning, building a different structure, the one that was going to let him deal with Marco and Reno Ferrante and Victor Caruso in the correct sequence. He fell asleep at his desk. He woke at 6 to his phone buzzing with a message from Nora. Milo slept fine. He wants to know if there's a pool. He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, there's a pool. Then, after a pause, I'll handle the rest of this today. She did not respond to that, which was its own answer. The meeting with Marco was set for 10. Damien arrived at the office at 8 and spent 2 hours reviewing everything he had, the files, the financial trail, the pattern of outside contacts, and by 9:50 he was as certain as he was going to get without a confession. The case against Marco was not a courtroom case. It was a mafia case, which meant the standard of proof was different and the outcome of conviction was different, and Damien had known for 2 days what the outcome was going to have to be. He had been moving slowly because part of him, the part that had trusted Marco's face for 12 years, that had understood Marco's voice as a constant in the landscape of his professional life, was resisting the destination even while his feet moved toward it. Marco arrived at 10 exactly. He sat down across the desk with the ease of a man who had been sitting in this office for over a decade and understood it as a space where his presence was expected and welcome. And he looked at Damien with that open, attentive face and said, "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," Damien said. "The Prescott situation keeping you up?" "Among other things." Damien set a single folder on the desk between them. "I want you to look at something." Marco reached for the folder. He opened it. Inside were 6 pages. Not all of the evidence, but the 6 most specific pieces. The financial trail, 2 of the outside contact records, and a phone log from 5 days before the warehouse raid 6 years ago, showing 3 calls between a number registered to Marco's secondary burner and a number that mapped to the DeLuca family's operations coordinator. Marco looked at the pages with his face doing nothing. This was the tell. Not guilt, not fear, not scrambling, nothing. A man encountering information he'd never seen before make some kind of small movement, even an unconscious one. A man encountering information he recognizes and has prepared for has already decided on the nothing, has rehearsed it, is performing it now with the smooth delivery of 12 years of practice. "This is old," Marco said. "Yes," Damien said. "Where did you pull this from?" "I built it," Damien said, "over the last 48 hours, from pieces that were always there." He paused. "I should have built it 6 years ago." Marco closed the folder. He set it back on the desk with the careful precision of a man who is very deliberately not pushing it away, not accepting it, but placing it in a neutral position between them, which was itself, Damien thought, a kind of answer. "You were angry 6 years ago," Marco said. "Anger makes men careless with evidence." "I know," Damien said. "Whatever you think this shows, it shows that you fed information to the DeLuca family," Damien said. "It shows that you built a case against Nora Bennett using documentation you created or sourced through a contact in the DeLuca operation, and you delivered it to me at the precise moment when I was most likely to believe it without looking closely at the seams." He paused. "And it shows that you made a phone call to Reno Ferrante 48 hours ago that preceded by approximately 6 hours Ferrante's men appearing outside Nora Bennett's building." The silence in the office had a different quality now. Marco looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Not the mask dropping exactly, but a recalibration, the same thing Damien had heard in the pause on the phone the day before. The recalibration of a man who has concluded that the door he thought was closed has in fact been open for some time and is now deciding how to stand in the open doorway. "You were going to marry her," Marco said, 6 years ago. You were going to walk away from half of what you'd built because you couldn't think straight when she was in the room. That wasn't your decision to make, Damien said. Somebody had to make it. Marco's voice was still controlled, still even, but there was something underneath the evenness now. Not remorse, not exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has done something he genuinely believed was necessary and is not fully prepared to be wrong about it. You were building an empire. You had momentum. You had structure. You had relationships that were going to compound into real power, and you were throwing it away for a woman who didn't understand what she was part of. She understood exactly what she was part of, Damien said. That was the problem. She understood it, and it scared her, and she asked me to think about leaving it. And instead of thinking about it, I let you hand me a reason to destroy her, and I took it with both hands. He looked at Marco with the cold, dense certainty that had been building for 2 days. Tell me about Victor Caruso. Marco was very still. Tell me how long he's been part of this, Damien said. Because I've been sitting with the timeline, and the Café Solène suggestion didn't come from nowhere, and the acceleration of the wedding timeline happened the day after I was in that cafe. And I need to know whether I walked into Victor's house last night and had dinner with a man who has been running Marco Vitale for years, or one who came to the same conclusion Marco did and made his own arrangements. The stillness lasted 4 seconds. Then Marco said, Victor came to me 3 years ago. He had information about the Fiancée situation. Information that suggested Reno was going to make a move on your Eastern operations, and he offered to share it in exchange for a conversation. He paused. The conversation was about you, about your stability, about whether you were the kind of man who could be relied upon to honor an alliance once you had personal complications. Personal complications, Damien said. He'd had you looked at. He knew about Nora. He knew about the boy before you did. Marco's voice was flat now, factual, the voice of a man delivering a report. He chose Café Solène specifically so you would see them. He wanted to know how you would react. The room was very quiet. He wanted to know if discovering you had a son would make you manageable, Damien said. He wanted to know if it would make you human, Marco said, which to Victor Caruso means the same thing. Damien sat with this. He sat with the specific, comprehensive weight of what Marco had just said, not the betrayal itself, which he had already built toward over 2 days and which had the quality of a thing he'd already accepted, but the full picture of it. Victor Caruso, who had engineered this from the beginning, who had chosen the cafe, who had watched Damien's face when he saw Nora, who had accelerated the wedding timeline, not because he was eager to close the deal, but because he was eager to get Damien inside the Caruso structure before Damien fully understood what he was walking into. The merger was not an alliance. It was a mechanism. A 5-year construction designed to put Damien Moretti's operation inside a structure controlled by Victor Caruso, locked in place by a marriage to Victor's daughter, secured by the knowledge that Damien had a son who could be used as a pressure point whenever the locked door needed to be reminded that it was locked. And Marco had been Victor's instrument for 3 years. Damien stood up from the desk. He picked up his phone, his jacket, and the folder of evidence. He said to Marco very quietly, "Don't leave the building." Marco said nothing. Damien walked out of the office, down the corridor, past the 2 men standing at the outer door who were Marco's men, and who looked at him with the specific, careful attention of people who had already been told something by someone, and out into the morning. He was in the elevator when his phone rang. "Isabella." He answered. "I need to see you," she said. Her voice was different from anything he'd heard from her before. Stripped of the precise, bloodless efficiency, stripped of the professional register. What was underneath sounded like someone who had made a decision and was frightened of having made it. "Not at the house. Not anywhere my father can—" She stopped. "There's a parking structure on Vance Street, level 4. Can you be there in 20 minutes? He thought about Victor's careful eyes and folded hands, and the smile that told him nothing about what was underneath it. "Yes," he said. Isabella was already there when he pulled in, standing beside her car in a dark coat with her arms at her sides, not crossed, which was unusual for her, and her hair down, which he had never seen. She looked younger without the precise construction of her usual presentation, and also considerably more frightened. He parked and walked to her. "My father knows about the boy," she said before he could speak. "He's known for months. He told me last night, after you left." Her voice was controlled but effortful. the specific effort of a woman trained to be composed, managing something that exceeded the training. He told me because he wanted me to understand what the marriage was securing. He said, his words, that a man with a child he doesn't know about is a man who can be reminded of his obligations. Damien listened. He's been working with Marco Vitale, she continued, longer than 3 years. Marco came to my father first, before your name was even on our radar as a potential alliance, and offered information about your operation in exchange for protection from you if you ever found out what he'd done. My father saw a different opportunity. She stopped and breathed. I didn't know any of this until last night. I want you to know that. Do you want me to believe you? He said. I want you to make your own assessment, she said. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm here because... She looked at him with something raw in her face that he had not seen before. Because I am not my father, and because whatever you decide to do, you should have the whole picture first. He looked at her for a long moment. There's more, she said. He waited. My father made a call this morning, she said. I heard part of it. He's moving the timeline up again. Not the wedding, the other thing. He's telling Ferrante to stop waiting and make the move. He said, her voice tightened slightly. He said the woman and the boy are more useful as leverage inside a controlled situation than outside one. The air in the parking structure was cold and smelled of concrete and exhaust. Damien understood what Isabella was telling him with the comprehensive, instantaneous clarity of a man who has spent 15 years reading threats. Victor Caruso had just authorized Rino Ferrante to take Nora and Milo, not to harm them, to hold them, to put them somewhere controlled, where Victor could remind Damien, whenever the need arose, of his obligations. He was already moving toward his car. Damien, Isabella's voice behind him. He stopped. My father thinks he owns you now, she said. I think he's made a mistake about what kind of man you are. He didn't respond to this. He got in the car and called Carmine and said, The hotel, right now, move them. Don't wait for me, don't call me until you have them in the car, move. Then he called the man on the lobby level. No answer. He called the man on the floor. No answer. He sat in the parking structure for one cold, terrible second, in which the thing he had been most afraid of organized itself from possibility into fact. And then he was driving, both hands on the wheel, the city moving past him at a speed that should have been illegal, the phone on the seat beside him silent, in the way that phones are silent when the people you've called are no longer in a position to answer. The hotel was 11 minutes away. He made it in 6. I was out of the car before it stopped and through the lobby in 8 strides into the elevator and up to the 4th floor, and the door to room 412 was open. Not broken open. Open. The way a door is open when someone has used a key card, when someone has walked through it calmly and with time to spare, when someone knew exactly where to go and went there without urgency because they were confident there was no one coming quickly enough to matter. Nora's bag was still on the bed. Milo's library book was on the nightstand. The room was empty. Damien stood in the doorway of the empty room, and the cold, dense certainty that had been organizing itself for 2 days became something else entirely. Not certainty, not anger in any controlled form, but something rawer and less manageable than either of those things. Something that had the quality of a man who has just understood the full scope of what he is willing to destroy in order to undo what has been done. His phone rang. The same number as yesterday morning. The same unhurried voice. Mr. Moretti, the voice said. They're safe, for now. We thought it was time to move to the next stage of our conversation. Damien said nothing. Victor would like you to come to the house, the voice said. Tonight, alone. And he would like you to understand before you arrive that the conversation is going to be about what the next phase of your cooperation looks like. Because the alliance is happening, Mr. Moretti. The wedding is happening. And the woman and the boy will be perfectly comfortable as long as you make the right decisions going forward. The silence on the line was absolute. Mr. Moretti, the voice said. Damien said very quietly, Tell Victor I'll be there. He hung up. He stood in the doorway of the empty room with Milo's library book on the nightstand, and the weight of everything he had built, and everything he had destroyed, and everything he had refused to look at directly for 6 years, organized into a single, irrevocable decision. And for the first time in 15 years, the man who had turned himself into an empire understood that the empire was the problem. and that what came next was not going to look like anything he had ever been before. He had 4 hours before tonight. 4 hours to build something that should have taken 4 days, using men he could trust when trust had just been demonstrated to be the most expensive commodity in his inventory. He stood in the hotel corridor outside the empty room and made 3 phone calls in the space of 90 seconds, and then he walked back to the elevator and went downstairs and sat in the car and made 4 more. The first call was to a man named Dex Paulson, who was not in Damien's organization and never had been. An independent, the kind of professional who moved between structures without belonging to any of them, whose only consistent loyalty was to the quality of the work and the reliability of the payment. Damien had used him twice in 12 years. Both times, it had been the right call. "I need a location pulled," Damien said. "Victor Caruso. He's moved 2 people, a woman and a child, in the last 2 hours. They'll be somewhere controlled, somewhere he owns or has access to. I need the location in 3 hours." "That's a short window," Dex said. "I know." "The premium applies." "The premium applies," Damien said. "Call me when you have it." The second call was to a man named Sutton, who handled logistics for the Eastern operation and whose connection to Marco was administrative rather than personal. A man who knew the structure but sat far enough from the center that Victor Caruso's reach probably hadn't gotten to him yet. Probably. "I need 6 men," Damien said. "Reliable. Not from the inner circle. Men who understand the job without needing it explained 3 times. 6, Sutton said. "Tonight?" "Tonight." A pause. "That's going to require some explanation on my end." "Tell them Damien Moretti is asking personally," Damien said. "That should cover the explanation." The third call was to Carmine. Carmine didn't answer. Damien sat with the phone in his hand for a moment and felt, in the specific hollow of his chest that had been accumulating weight for 2 days, another piece of the picture settle into place with the particular finality of a thing that cannot be unsettled. Carmine had been with him for 9 years. Carmine had driven him, had sat in silence while he thought out loud, had positioned men at Nora's building and at the hotel, and had known exactly where they were at every moment. He put the phone in his pocket. He drove to the office building, went up to the second floor where Sutton operated, and spent 40 minutes going through what he needed with the directness of a man who no longer had the time or interest in building up to things. Sutton listened, asked 3 specific questions, and did not ask any of the questions that were none of his business. He was going to have 6 men ready by 5. At 1:15, Damien went back to the car. A different car now, one from the building's secondary pool that was not in Carmine's daily rotation, and drove to a diner on the west side that he had used occasionally over the years as a place to think without being watched. He ordered coffee. He didn't drink and sat in the corner booth with his back to the wall and the door in his sight line. And he built the plan in his head the way he built everything, from the outside in, identifying the fixed points first, and working toward the center. Fixed points. Victor Caruso expected him at the house tonight, alone. Victor believed Damien's compliance was secured by Nora and Milo's location, which Victor controlled. Victor also believed that whatever Damien might want to do about it, the weight of 15 years of organizational investment, the relationships, the territory, the money, the network of mutual obligation that constituted the Moretti Empire, would function as a brake on any action Victor hadn't authorized. Victor was right that it would function as a brake. He was wrong about whether Damien was still willing to be braked. At 2:40, Dex called. "There's a warehouse on the edge of the Kellner industrial block," Dex said. "Caruso has a holding interest in it through a property management shell, the kind of arrangement that wouldn't show up in a casual search but leaves a trail if you know what you're looking for. It went active this morning. Utilities, heat, and I'm reading 2 mobile signals registered to Ferrante's organizational network inside the building." 2 guards, Damien said. "That's my read. It's not a fortress. It's a secure room, temporary." He wasn't expecting to need it long. "Because he expects compliance tonight," Damien said. "That would be the logic." Damien wrote down the address. He already knew the building. He knew most of the industrial properties on the Kellner block because the Eastern operation ran adjacent to it, and he had considered the area for expansion twice. The warehouse was large, single story at the front, with a secondary structure in the back that had been a cold storage annex. That was where they'd be. The annex controlled space, restricted access. "One more thing," Dex said. "There's a 3rd signal, different registration, not Ferrante." "Whose?" A pause. Carmine Salto's personal device. Damien was quiet. You want me to stay on it? Dex said. No, Damien said. I have what I need. He hung up. He sat in the diner booth with the cold coffee in front of him and let himself, for 30 seconds, feel what it felt like to have this confirmed. Carmine, 9 years, the man who had driven him through the city in the dark and in the early morning, and in every configuration of his professional life, positioned inside the warehouse where they were holding Nora and Milo. The man who had moved his men off position long enough for Victor's people to walk through the hotel room door. 30 seconds. Then he put it away. He had work to do. He arrived at the warehouse at 8:17. He came alone, because Victor expected him alone at the house, and the warehouse was not where Victor expected him. He came in through the service entrance on the west side, which Dex had confirmed was unwatched. With 2 of Sutton's men at positions he'd placed himself at 7:45 before he'd gone in. The other 4 were on the perimeter. Not because he expected a fight of that scale, 2 guards and Carmine against 7 including himself, but because the perimeter was the thing that could go wrong, and he had spent 15 years being meticulous about the things that could go wrong. The warehouse interior was cold and smelled of old hydraulic fluid and the particular staleness of a space that had been closed a long time and recently reopened. The lights were industrial, high, flat, casting everything in a colorless wash that made shadows hard and edges harsh. He moved through the front section toward the annex door at the back, and he moved quickly because quickly was the only speed available now. He heard Carmine before he saw him. Carmine was in the corridor between the main floor and the annex, standing, which meant he was on watch rather than sitting with the others, which was useful information about how the arrangement was structured. He turned when he heard Damien's footstep on the concrete, and his face did something that Damien watched carefully. Not surprise, not guilt, but a complicated calculation that moved through several stages in about a second and a half, and arrived at something that looked, in the flat industrial light, almost like relief, which was itself a kind of thing to absorb. Damien, Carmine said. Where are they? Damien said. In the annex. They're not hurt. 2 of Reno's men in there with them. He paused. Victor wanted them watched, not touched. I know what Victor wanted. Damien moved past him toward the annex door and Carmine stepped aside. Not reluctantly, not with any show of resistance. And that was the most comprehensive answer to the question of whether Carmine had already made his decision about tonight. Damien opened the annex door. The room beyond was a 20 by 30 concrete space with a single overhead light, 2 folding chairs, and a cot along the back wall. Nora was on the cot with Milo tucked against her side, his backpack still on because he had refused to take it off. Damien understood this later from her that Milo had simply decided the backpack was staying on and had said so once in a tone that had not invited negotiation. She had her arm around him and her hand flat against the back of his head, and she was reading aloud from his library book in a voice pitched low and steady and completely controlled, the voice of a woman who had decided that whatever else was happening, she was going to give this child the experience of being read to in a calm voice, and nothing was going to stop that. She looked up when the door opened. The 2 men in the room, Fiancées, young, both tense with the coiled unease of people assigned a job that had gotten heavier than advertised, looked at Damien and then at each other and then reached the conclusion that Sutton's 2 men, who had come through behind Damien, helped them reach quickly and without extended discussion. Damien crossed the room. He stopped at the edge of the cot. Milo had pulled back from the book and was looking at him with those dark, direct eyes that assessed everything with the same comprehensive seriousness. He was not crying. He had not been crying, Damien could tell. His face was clear, his jaw set with the specific determination of a small person who had decided that this was a situation being handled and that his job was to not make it harder. He had his mother in him all the way through. Hi, Milo said. Hi, Damien said. Mom said you were coming. He looked at Nora. She was looking at him with something in her face that was different from anything he'd seen there yet. Not anger, not resignation, not the exhausted patience of 2 days ago. Something that had been burned down to a simpler element. Something that was just real. The way a person's face is real when the situation has stripped away everything that isn't absolutely necessary. Can we go? She said. Yes, he said. Now? Right now. She stood, bringing Milo up with her, and he hiked the backpack onto both shoulders with the buckle across the chest precision he'd demonstrated at the school, and they moved toward the door. In the corridor, Carmine was still standing where Damien had left him. Nora stopped when she saw him. Something crossed her face. Recognition, he thought, or something adjacent to it. The recognition of a person who has been told things about the shape of her situation and is now seeing one of the shapes. She walked past him without speaking. Milo walked past him with the backpack bouncing slightly with each step and didn't look up. Carmine looked at Damien. "I didn't know about the boy," Carmine said. "When Marco first brought me into it, I didn't know what the original situation was. By the time I did..." He stopped. "By the time you did, you were already in it," Damien said. Carmine said nothing. "Go home," Damien said. "Don't contact Marco. Don't contact Victor. Wait." It was not a merciful instruction, and it was not a cruel one. It was a postponement. The decision about Carmine was going to have to be made, but not tonight, and not in a warehouse corridor with Nora and Milo 20 feet away. Carmine nodded once. Damien walked out. He put Nora and Milo in the car and gave the driver an address, a property on the north side that existed outside every organizational record, that he had purchased under a name that connected to nothing in Victor's intelligence, that he had maintained for exactly this kind of contingency. A clean house. Supplied. Secure. Milo fell asleep in the back seat within 7 minutes, backpack still on, head against Nora's arm. Nora did not speak for a long time. Then, quietly, "What are you going to do?" "Tonight I'm going to go to Victor's house," he said. Like he asked. She looked at him. "Alone?" she said. "No," he said. She absorbed this. "Is this..." She stopped. Started again. "Is this going to be the kind of thing where more people get hurt?" "Yes," he said. Because she deserved honest answers, and because she had already demonstrated, across 6 years of navigating the consequences of his world without any of its protections, that she could handle honest answers better than almost anyone he knew. She looked out the window at the moving city. "Okay," she said. Just that. "Okay." Not agreement exactly. Not endorsement. But the specific acknowledgement of a woman who has accepted that the world she is in has its own physics, and that tonight those physics are going to operate, and her job is to get herself and her son through to the other side of it. "Nora," he said. She didn't look at him. "What Marco did," he said. "What I did. Those aren't the same thing, but they're both..." He stopped because he had been trying to find the sentence for 2 days and he still didn't have it. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I just need you to know that I understand the size of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Damien," she said, "go deal with Victor Caruso. We'll talk about the rest when there's time for it." He nodded. The car pulled up to the north side property. His man was on the door. Nora got out and lifted Milo, still asleep, the backpack making it awkward, his head drooping against her shoulder with the boneless trust of a sleeping child, and carried him toward the door without looking back. Damien watched them go in. Then he said to the driver, "Victor Caruso's house." He arrived at 9:40. Victor's men were at the door, 4 of them, which was 2 more than usual, which told him Victor was nervous under the composed exterior, which was useful. He went through the door without being searched, which told him Victor still believed in the theater of the controlled situation, still believed that Damien was arriving as a man whose compliance had been secured. Victor was in the study. He was standing when Damien came in, which was different from the dining room formality of last night. Standing, with a glass of something amber in his hand and the specific quality of stillness that belonged to a man who had been waiting and was now performing the ease of a man who had not been waiting. The fire in the study grate was lit. The room smelled of old wood and that amber drink and something underneath both of them that Damien identified after a moment as the smell of a space where power had been exercised for a long time. 2 of Victor's men were in the room, positioned at the far wall. Victor said, "Damien, I'm glad you came." "You didn't give me much of a choice," Damien said. "There's always a choice," Victor said. "That's what I find men in your position often forget. The choice is just not always comfortable." He gestured toward the chair across from his own. "Sit." Damien did not sit. Victor studied him. Something moved behind the old careful eyes. Not concern exactly, but a recalibration. The same quality he'd heard in Marco on the phone, in Reno after the sedan. The recalibration of a man who has built a structure and is noticing, for the first time, that the load-bearing element might not be where he placed it. "The woman and the boy are safe," Victor said. "I want you to know that." "I know," Damien said. "They're not at the warehouse anymore." Victor was very still. "I pulled them out 2 hours ago," Damien said. "They're somewhere you don't have access to and aren't going to find tonight." He let that sit for a moment. "I came here anyway because there are things that need to be said directly, and I've spent enough of my life having things said through intermediaries." Victor set his glass down on the desk beside him, slowly, deliberately, with the careful movement of a man adjusting to new information without wanting to show the effort of the adjustment. "You're making a mistake," Victor said. "Tell me about the mistake," Damien said. "Everything I've built, the alliance, the network, the Eastern Corridor arrangement, requires stability, personal stability. A man running an operation of this scale cannot afford complications of the kind you've accumulated." Victor's voice was still controlled, still warm in its particular constructed way, but there was something harder underneath it now that the theater was losing its frame. "I'm not your enemy, Damien. I've been trying to build something with you that protects both of our interests for 5 years. By engineering my exposure," Damien said. "By staging the moment I would see Nora and Milo so you could watch my reaction and determine whether I was manageable. By using Marco to feed information to Fiancée and then using Fiancée as the instrument to take them." He looked at Victor steadily. "By building a marriage alliance designed not to give me power, but to put me inside a structure where my power could be controlled." Victor looked at him. "That's business," Victor said. "That's how alliances work. You know this. You've been doing it for 15 years. "I have," Damien said, "and I'm done with it." The room was very quiet. "The alliance is over," Damien said. "The wedding is over. Isabella can confirm she came to me with information about your operation, which she did, and that ends her obligation to any of this. Marco is finished. I'll deal with him separately, and that's not your concern. Reno Ferrante is going to spend the next 6 months being reminded of what happens when someone touches a civilian in my city." He paused. "And you're going to step back from the Eastern Corridor arrangements, return the territory you've been quietly absorbing over the past 2 years, and retire." Victor stared at him. Then he laughed. A short, genuine sound, surprised out of him despite the composure. "You're not serious." "I'm always serious," Damien said. "You came here alone." "I didn't," Damien said. And at that moment the window at the far end of the study came open. Not broken, opened from the outside, smoothly, and with the confidence of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. And Sutton's man came through it, and simultaneously the door to the corridor opened behind Damien, and 2 more came through that, and Victor Caruso's 2 men at the wall looked at each other with the specific expression of people who have just conducted a rapid tactical reassessment and arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. Victor looked at his men. He looked at Damien. His face was doing something Damien had not seen it do in 2 evenings of careful observation. It was losing the construction. Not dramatically, not completely, but in the specific way that faces lose their constructions when the underlying calculation fails, when the room that was built to have no exits turns out to have been built on someone else's floor plan. "You're burning everything," Victor said. His voice was still controlled, but the warmth was gone, and what was left was just the hard thing underneath it. "Everything you've built. For a woman and a boy." "Yes," Damien said. "That's not rational." "No," Damien said. "It isn't." He looked at Victor Caruso, at the old careful eyes and the folded hands, and the careful construction of a man who had spent 50 years turning people into instruments. And for a moment he saw himself in it, saw the version of himself that the next 15 years would have produced if he had walked into this house tonight and sat down and accepted the terms and continued to build the empire on its existing foundation. He didn't look away from what he saw. "You have 2 options," Damien said. "The first is that you accept the terms I've laid out, and we part ways with a minimum of additional damage to both organizations. The second option involves a conversation that neither of us is going to enjoy, and that is going to have consequences that extend well beyond this room." Victor's jaw was tight. "You're not the only one with something to lose," Damien said. "I have files, Victor. I have years of documentation on the arrangement with Marco, on the Ferrante coordination, on the territory absorption, on a number of other things that federal investigators would find extremely interesting, and that I have arranged, through a third party with no connection to my organization, to be delivered to two separate task forces if I don't make a specific call in the next, he checked his watch, 40 minutes. The silence in the study had the quality of a held breath. Victor looked at him for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "You planned this." "I planned the parts I could plan," Damien said. "The rest I improvised." He paused. "The call. Your answer." Victor Caruso, who had built 50 years of careful power on the premise that every man had a price and every situation had a lock, looked at Damien Moretti across the width of his study and arrived at a conclusion that Damien could see moving across the old, careful face. Not defeat exactly, not surrender, but the specific recognition of a man who has bet on the wrong variable and is precise enough to acknowledge it. "Get out of my house," Victor said. "After your answer," Damien said. A long pause. "The terms," Victor said. "The corridor, the alliance." He said each word like a stone being set down. "Accepted." Damien held the look for 3 more seconds. Then he turned toward the door. "Damien," Victor's voice behind him. Still controlled, still that specific quality of a man who has never fully abandoned his composure and was not going to start tonight. "You understand this doesn't end here." Damien stopped at the door. "I know," he said. "Neither does anything else." He walked out of the study, down the corridor, past the 4 men at the door who stepped aside without being asked, and out into the night air, cold and concrete-smelling and ordinary. The city making its ordinary nighttime sounds around the dark Georgian house, and its old power and its failed architecture. He stood on the front steps for a moment and breathed. His hands were steady. His chest was doing something he didn't have clinical language for, something that had the quality of a structure under pressure finding, against its own expectations, that it had not collapsed. He had gone into that room prepared to lose everything he'd built, prepared to pay whatever the full price was, and the full price had not been collected tonight, and he was standing outside in the cold air, and Nora and Milo were in a house on the north side, and Victor Caruso had said the word accepted in the tone of a man who meant it because he had no remaining choice. But Victor was right. It didn't end here. Marco was still out there. Reno Ferrante was still a problem. The organizations on both sides of the dissolved alliance were going to shift and test and probe for weakness in the space the dissolution created. The next 3 months were going to require a kind of sustained, meticulous effort that he had not been prepared for 48 hours ago. And on the other side of all of it, in a house on the north side with a man on the door, there was a 6-year-old boy with a backpack buckled across his chest who did not yet know what his life was connected to. His phone buzzed. "Sutton. All clear. Your men are out. Perimeter holding." He typed back, "Stand down. Thank you." Then he stood on the steps of Victor Caruso's house for another 30 seconds, looking at the city, and thought about what it meant to be a man who had just traded an empire for the possibility of something that had no name in the vocabulary he'd been using for 15 years. He thought, "I don't know what I'm building next." He thought, "That might be the first honest thing I've known in a long time." His phone buzzed again. The number was Nora's. He answered. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and still had that stripped-down quality. The real thing, no construction around it. And she said, "He woke up and asked if you were coming back." Damien was very still on the steps. "What did you tell him?" he said. A pause. "I told him I didn't know yet," she said. "And he said, okay, and went back to sleep." Another pause. "So, are you?" The city moved around him in its ordinary, indifferent way, and somewhere across it Marco Vitale was waiting, and the Ferrante situation was waiting, and the wreckage of 5 years of organizational architecture was waiting, and Damien Moretti, who had built everything on the premise that certainty was the only thing worth having, stood on a step in the dark and held a phone to his ear and gave the only answer he had that was completely honest. "I'm on my way," he said. He drove across the city with the windows down despite the cold. He needed the air. He needed the specific discomfort of it, the way it came in sharp at the jaw and the throat and made everything immediate and physical and present, because the alternative was sitting inside his own head in the back of a warm car, and he had been inside his own head for 3 days, and what was in there needed time to settle before he could look at it clearly. The north side property was a narrow two-story on a quiet block, brick, old trees in front, the kind of house that had been built when the neighborhood was working class and had survived into a different era without losing the fundamental quality of a place where people actually lived. He had bought it 4 years ago, through the kind of arrangement that left no trace, and he had maintained it as a contingency with the specific, meticulous caution that he brought to every contingency, and he had never imagined the contingency would be this. His man at the door stepped aside without speaking. Damien went in. The house was quiet, in the way that houses are quiet when a child has recently gone to sleep, a particular quality of silence that is not empty but held, like a breath being kept. The lights in the front room were low. Nora was on the couch with her knees drawn up and a mug of something warm between her hands. And she looked up when he came through the door with the expression of a woman who has been waiting and does not want to appear to have been waiting and is not sufficiently invested in the theater of it to fully conceal the waiting. He sat down in the chair across from her. They looked at each other in the low light. He said, "Victor agreed to the terms." "I heard," she said. "Sutton's man told me." "Marco is going to be dealt with tomorrow," he said, formally, with documentation and with witnesses so it can't be undone or reversed later. The Fiancée situation is going to take longer, but it's containable. He paused. "The alliance with Caruso is finished." She nodded slowly. "The wedding," he said. "I assumed," she said. "Isabella came to me with information that broke the arrangement on her end. She's out of it clean. Victor knows it and doesn't have grounds to—" "Damien," Nora said quietly. He stopped. "I don't need the operational summary," she said. "I trust that you've handled it. That's not what I need to talk about tonight." He was quiet. She looked at him with those clear, patient eyes that were 6 years older and carried 6 years more in them, and he held the look the way he'd held it in the cafe, without flinching, without reaching for the deflection that was always available to him if he wanted it. "What do you need to talk about?" he said. She turned the mug slowly in her hands, clockwise, then back. A small rotation, repeated. He recognized the gesture. She had always done it with coffee cups, with glasses, with anything that fit between her palms. And the recognition of it landed somewhere in him that he didn't have a clinical name for. "When you sent me away," she said, 6 years ago, "when you told me to go." She paused. "I want you to know what that was. Not for you. I'm not telling you for you. I'm telling you because if we're going to have any kind of honest conversation going forward, I need it said out loud at least once." "Okay," he said. "I was 8 weeks pregnant," she said. "I had known for 4 days. I hadn't told you yet because I was still figuring out what it meant, what I wanted, whether there was a version of a life that could hold all of it." She stopped, breathed. The mug rotated once more. "And then Marco came in with that folder, and you looked at me the way you looked at me, and I understood that I wasn't going to be able to explain anything, that whatever I said was going to be received as the words of someone who had already been convicted." She looked up at him. "So I left." "Yes," he said. "I moved to a city where I didn't know anyone, and I had Milo in a hospital where the intake nurse was the only person in the room, and I named him Emilio because that was my grandfather's name, and I needed him to belong to something besides the situation he'd come out of." Her voice was steady. She was not crying, and she was not going to cry. He understood this from the specific quality of the steadiness, which was not suppression, but the genuine flatness of a woman who had cried everything available to her a long time ago and had arrived on the other side of it. "I worked. I moved back here 14 months ago because I had run out of runway, and this was the only city I knew well enough to rebuild in. And I chose that neighborhood specifically because I calculated you would never have a reason to go there." "I know," he said. "And then you walked into the cafe," she said, "and sat down at the counter." A pause. "And now we're here." The fire was not lit in the north side house. There was no fireplace. But the radiator in the corner was putting out steady heat, the old kind, and the low light, and the quiet, and the mug between her hands, and the specific quality of the silence between them had a density to it that was not comfortable and was not supposed to be comfortable and was, he thought, the most honest room he had sat in for years. "I can't fix it," he said. "No," she said. "I can tell you that I understand what it cost. I can tell you that I've understood it more clearly every hour of the past 3 days. But I know that understanding it isn't the same as stop, she said. Not harshly, just stop. I know you understand it. That's not the question. What's the question? He said. She looked at him for a long moment. Milo doesn't know who you are, she said. He knows your face from the cafe. He knows you came to the warehouse and got us out. He knows you're... He said, when he woke up tonight, that you were the man from the cafe who was helping us. She paused. He's 6. He's going to ask questions when the situation settles. He's already the kind of person who asks questions and waits for complete answers. A small, brief thing crossed her face at this. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The involuntary recognition of a mother who knows her child's specific character down to the grain. So the question is what we tell him. And what we tell him depends on what this is, what we're doing, what you want. Damien looked at his hands on his knees. He had spent 15 years knowing exactly what he wanted, and exactly how to get it, and exactly what he was willing to sacrifice in service of it. And the certainty of this had been the organizing principle of his entire adult life. And sitting in this room in the low light across from this woman, he understood that the certainty had been the cage, and the cage had been the problem from the beginning. I want to know him, he said. I want to know you. I don't know what the shape of it looks like yet, and I know I don't have the right to ask for anything specific. And I know that every decision has to be yours because you're the one who's been making decisions about him for 6 years, and I haven't earned the standing to override that. He paused. But I want... Yes, if you'll allow it. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he asked if you were coming back. You told me, he said. He doesn't ask that about people, she said. He's careful about who he asks that about. He has his grandmother's instincts, my mother's. She always knew, my mother, which people were going to stay and which ones were performing staying. She turned the mug once more. He asked about you. The radiator knocked once in the corner, the sound that old radiators make when the heat shifts in the pipes. I'll stay, Damien said. If you'll let me figure out what that means in a way that doesn't damage him, I'll stay and I'll be slow about it and I'll follow your lead on every piece of it. Nora looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, with all 6 years in her face and all the weight of what had been done and survived and built in the space of those years, and he held the look completely still and let her see whatever she needed to see in it. Okay, she said, just that. The same word she'd used in the car, with the same quality. Not forgiveness, not yet, not something that simple or that complete, but the acknowledgement of a woman who had decided that the door was not fully closed and was willing to find out what was on the other side of leaving it open. Okay, he said. Oh, in the morning, the reckoning with Marco. Damien was at the office at 7. Sutton was there, and 2 men from the outer organizational structure whose connection to Marco was minimal and whose reliability had been established through the specific, unglamorous test of years of consistent work. The documentation was on the desk. The files Damien had built over 3 days, the financial trail, the contact records, the phone log from 6 years ago. Comprehensive, irrefutable in the way that things are irrefutable when they have been assembled by someone who knew exactly where to look because he was the one who had been deceived. Marco arrived at 7:30. He came in without being escorted, which meant he had not yet been told that the terms of his arrival had changed. He came through the office door with the ease of 12 years of habit and stopped when he saw the room. Sutton, the 2 men, the documentation on the desk, and Damien standing at the window with his back to the door. A pause. Then Damien turned. Marco looked at the files and then at Damien, and his face did the thing it had done in this office 2 days ago, the careful nothing, the performed composure. But it was thinner this time. The architecture of it was visible in a way it hadn't been before, the way a building structure becomes visible when the facade has been partially removed. Sit down, Damien said. Marco sat. Damien remained standing. I'm not going to give you a long speech, Damien said. You know what's in those files. You know what they show. I'm going to tell you what happens next, and I'm going to tell you once. Marco's hands were on the desk, flat, still. He was very good. Good. The documentation goes to 3 separate parties, Damien said. One inside the organization, the council, who will make their own determination about your standing. One outside, a legal intermediary with instructions to proceed if I indicate or if I become unreachable, and one to the Federal Task Force on Organized Crime, which has had an open file on our operations for 4 years and will find the material about the DeLuca coordination and the warehouse raid particularly interesting, given that 3 men died in it. He paused. The federal piece is contingent. It only moves if you attempt to use any of the leverage you've accumulated against me, against Nora Bennett, against her son, or against any member of my organization going forward. Marco was very still. What it means in practical terms, Damien said, is that you're finished here. The council is going to remove you from your position. You'll be allowed to leave the city. You'll have access to what you've personally earned, not what you've accumulated through the Caruso arrangement, which gets unwound separately. And you'll spend the rest of your life being a man who made a calculated decision, discovered it was the wrong one, and lived with that. Marco looked at him. You're not going to... He stopped. No, Damien said, I'm not. Marco absorbed this. Something moved across the careful face. Something Damien read as surprise, genuine surprise, which was itself informative about what Marco had expected walking into this room. Why? Marco said. Damien thought about Milo in the back seat of the car, asleep with the backpack on. He thought about Nora on the hotel cot reading aloud in a controlled, steady voice. I thought about the version of himself that would have walked into this room and made a different decision, and he thought about whether that version still existed somewhere in him, and whether it was something he needed to root out, or something he needed to simply stop feeding. Because I'm done building things with fear as the foundation, he said. And because 3 men are already dead because of what you did, and adding to that number doesn't bring them back. He turned to Sutton. Take him through the terms formally. Make sure the council documentation is filed by noon. He walked out of the office. The Fiancée situation took 11 days. Not through violence, through the specific, unglamorous work of organizational pressure applied at the correct points in the correct sequence. Damien spent those 11 days making calls, having meetings, applying the 15 years of accumulated leverage that was still his even with the Caruso alliance dissolved. And by the end of it, Reno Ferrante had retreated from every position he'd encroached on and had signed, through intermediaries, an acknowledgement of territorial boundaries that had the force of an organizational treaty. Reno was 20 years from understanding what he'd miscalculated. Maybe more. But he was alive and he was contained and the Eastern operation was intact, and that was sufficient for now. Victor Caruso was a longer and more complicated unwinding. The territory absorption, the quiet annexation of distribution lines and transport contracts that Victor had been conducting over 2 years, took 6 weeks to reverse, through a combination of documentation, direct negotiation with the individual operators who had been absorbed without fully understanding what they were being absorbed into, and the specific weight of Damien's name applied in rooms where it still meant something. Victor did not resist. He had the quality, Damien observed in their 2 subsequent brief and formal interactions, of a man who had made a large bet, lost it cleanly, and was now conducting himself with the precise dignity of someone who understood that how you lose is its own form of reputation management. Isabella he saw once more, briefly, at a neutral location she had requested, a coffee place on a street neither of them had any history with. She was composed in the way she was always composed, but there was something different in the composition now, something that had been rearranged in the same storm that had rearranged everything else. My father will recover, she said. He always does. I want you to know I wasn't part of it from the beginning. I know, Damien said. I also want you to know, she said, that I'm glad you burned it down. She said this without heat, without drama, just clearly, the way she said most things. The arrangement was, it would have been a very specific kind of unhappy, for both of us. I think we both knew that. Yes, he said. She looked at her coffee. The woman at the cafe. Yes, he said. She nodded once with the specific efficiency of a person receiving information they had already arrived at independently and filing it appropriately. She's lucky, Isabella said. Or you are. I'm not sure which way that runs. I don't know yet either, he said. They finished their coffee and parted without ceremony, and that was the end of that. The morning Damien met Milo properly, not in a corridor, not in a warehouse, not in a car at night, was a Saturday in early November, 5 weeks after everything. Nora had arranged it the way she arranged most things, directly, without elaboration, in advance, with a specific set of practical parameters that she laid out over the phone the night before. They would meet at a park near the north side. An hour, maybe less depending on how Milo was feeling about it. She was going to tell Milo the night before that Damien was his father. Not a story around it, not a softened version. The fact, in language a 6-year-old could hold. He'll have questions, Nora said. I know, Damien said. Some of them you won't have good answers to, she said. I need you to not invent good answers. I need you to tell him you don't know when you don't know. Okay, he said. He's going to be angry at some point, she said. Maybe not today, maybe not for a year, but at some point he's going to be angry that you weren't there, and I need you to hold that without deflecting it. Yes, he said. A pause. Damien, she said. Yes. He's the best thing I've ever done, she said, simply. Just that, without armor around it. I need you to understand that going in. I understand, he said. He was at the park at 9. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of November morning where the light is very precise and the air smells of dried leaves and something metallic underneath them that belongs to the season turning. Each sat on a bench near the south entrance and watched the park fill gradually with the ordinary Saturday population. Dog walkers, a couple with a stroller, 2 teenagers on the path, moving with the specific studied casualness of people who are trying to look like they are not paying attention to each other. Nora arrived at 9:12. Milo was beside her with the backpack, a different one, slightly smaller than the original, though still buckled across the chest. And he was wearing a red jacket that was very slightly too large for him, the sleeves coming down past his wrists so that his hands disappeared inside them when he let his arms hang, which he kept correcting by pushing the cuffs back up with the other hand in a repetitive automatic gesture. They came down the path toward the bench. Damien stood. Milo looked at him from 15 feet with those dark, direct eyes and stopped walking. Nora stopped with him. They stood there for a moment in the clear November light, the 3 of them. And Damien understood that this was a moment that was going to have to be what it was. Not managed, not engineered, not constructed with the architectural precision he had brought to everything for 15 years. Just real. He crossed the distance to them. He crouched down because he was tall enough that standing required Milo to crane upward at an angle that would have made it an uneven conversation, and crouching put them closer to eye level, and eye level was where this needed to happen. He looked at his son. Milo looked at him. The boy's face had the particular quality of a person who has been given new information and is processing it with genuine, unhurried seriousness, the way Damien had learned in 5 weeks of careful incremental proximity that Milo processed most things. Mom told me, Milo said. I know, Damien said. She said you didn't know about me, Milo said, for a long time. That's right, Damien said. Milo pushed his cuffs back up, both sleeves in sequence, then let his hands hang and watched the sleeves slide down again. Why? He said. Damien had known this question was coming. He had known it was the first question, the most important one, the one that a 6-year-old with his mother's clarity was going to ask before anything else, the one that required an honest answer in language that a child could actually hold. Because some people I trusted gave me wrong information, he said, a long time ago. And I believed the wrong information instead of your mom, and she had to go away. And I didn't know about you until I saw you at the cafe. Milo absorbed this. That was bad, Milo said. Yes, Damien said. It was. Did you say sorry to Mom? He looked up at Nora, who was standing 2 feet back and slightly to the side with her arms loose at her sides, and her expression doing the same stripped-down real thing it had been doing in the low light of the North Side house. I'm still working on it, he said. It's the kind of sorry that takes a long time. Milo considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then he said, My friend Terrell's dad was gone for a while and then he came back and now they go fishing on Saturdays. That's good, Damien said. I don't really like fishing, Milo said, but I like other stuff. What other stuff? Damien said. Milo pushed his cuffs up again. Building things, he said, and reading, and I'm learning chess. Mom's not very good at chess. From behind him, Nora made a small sound that was definitely not a laugh, and was adjacent to one. I'm good at chess, Damien said. Milo looked at him with the assessing directness that was going to make him, Damien thought, an extraordinarily difficult person to deceive in approximately 12 years. Okay, Milo said, and reached up and pulled the backpack straps more firmly onto his shoulders, which Damien had come to understand was his gesture for decision made, moving forward. Can we walk? Yes, Damien said. He stood. They walked. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about them was simple, and he had stopped expecting simplicity, had stopped reaching for it the way he had reached for certainty, that clean organizing principle that had run his life for so long, and that he was discovering in the slow work of every day was not actually what he had wanted. What he had wanted, underneath the certainty, was exactly this, something that was difficult and specific and real, something that pushed back against him and required him to be present in a way that managing an empire never had. Nora was not easy with him. She was not going to be easy with him for a long time, and he understood this and was not asking for easy. She was honest. That was the thing that was consistent, the thing he could orient around. When she was angry, she said so, without drama, in the specific direct language that he remembered from 6 years ago and that had apparently only gotten more precise with time. When something he did was wrong, she told him. When something was working, she told him that too, with the same matter-of-fact clarity, no performance in either direction. He was in the apartment on Prescott 3 evenings a week. Not staying, but not yet. That was a different conversation for a different season. But there, in the specific ordinariness of it, eating the food that was made in the kitchen, sitting on the floor with Milo and the chessboard that Milo had gotten for his birthday, and that Milo was considerably better at than he had initially let on, reading the library books that accumulated on the coffee table in rotating stacks. The first time Milo beat him at chess, genuinely, not conceited. The boy looked at the board for a moment after the final move and then looked at Damien with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding, and Damien said, "You've been letting me win." "Not every time," Milo said. "How many times?" A pause. "3, Milo said. "I was seeing how you acted when you lost." Damien looked at his son. "And?" he said. Milo considered. "You're okay at it," he said. "Some dads get weird." "I'll try not to get weird," Damien said. "Okay," Milo said, and began resetting the pieces with the focused efficiency of a person who is ready for the next game. The organization did not collapse. He had expected disruption, had prepared for it, had built contingencies for the relationships that would shift and the territory that would need to be resecured and the power vacuum that the Caruso dissolution would create and that other interests would move toward. The disruption came, and it was difficult, and it cost him months of careful, unglamorous work. But the core of what he'd built held, because the core had been built well, had been built on functional relationships and reliable delivery and the specific compounding trust that forms when an organization operates consistently over years. What he changed was the foundation. Not in a single decision, in hundreds of small ones, made over months, that redirected the organization away from the methods that had always made him most powerful and most exposed. The fear, the leverage, the carefully maintained network of obligation that functioned equally as a network of mutual vulnerability. He moved toward the parts of the operation that didn't require those methods. He reduced the parts that did. It was slow and it was imperfect, and there were decisions he made in that period that he was not comfortable with and that he accepted as the cost of transition rather than destination. He told Nora about this in the apartment kitchen on a Tuesday evening in December, sitting across from her with coffee between them the way they had sat across from each other 6 years ago in a different kitchen, in a different life. He told her because she asked, directly, what he was doing with the organization, and she asked because she was not going to be with a man who kept that part of his life in a room she wasn't allowed to see. She told him this in the North Side house the morning after everything, in the same matter-of-fact language she used for everything. "I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm asking you to not lie to me about what you are." He hadn't lied. He told her in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening what he was working toward and what it was costing and how long he thought it was going to take. And she listened with her hands around the mug and her clear, patient eyes on his face. And when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Is it enough," she said, "what you're moving toward?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I think so. I'm trying to find out." She nodded slowly. I'm not waiting for perfect, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not sitting here with a standard that you have to meet before I decide. I'm just... She stopped, started again. I need it to be real. The direction. Not performance. It's real, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. The kitchen was quiet. Through the wall from Milo's room, there was the faint sound of something. The specific nighttime sound of a child who has been put to bed and is conducting a quiet secondary activity under the impression that the adults cannot hear it, which in Milo's case appeared to involve either the chess set or the library books, or possibly both. Damien looked at his coffee. He thought about the man he had been walking into Café Solène 3 months ago. The charcoal suit and the 2 men in the car at the curb and the 5-year alliance on the table, and the particular armored certainty of a man who had arranged his entire life around the premise that control was the same thing as safety. He thought about the boy in the next room, conducting his covert nighttime operations, who had looked at him in a November park and asked a question that deserved an honest answer and accepted the honest answer with the same serious, unhurried gravity he brought to everything. He thought about what Nora had said on the phone the night before the park. He's the best thing I've ever done. He thought, this is what it costs. All of it. The empire, the certainty, the carefully maintained architecture of control. This is what you pay to sit in a kitchen on a Tuesday evening with cold coffee and a woman who is not going to let you be anything other than real. He thought, it's not enough of a price. He said quietly to Nora across the table, I'm sorry. She looked at him. I know I've said it, he said. I know it doesn't. I know what it doesn't fix. But I want to say it here, in a kitchen, without anything at stake. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she set her mug down and reached across the table and put her hand flat on the back of his hand, not holding it, not a grip, just placed it there, her palm against his knuckles, warm and present and real. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. From the next room, something fell. The chess pieces, from the sound of it, cascading off whatever surface Milo had been using and hitting the floor in a small, comprehensive scatter. A pause. Then Milo's voice, muffled through the wall, said with great dignity, I'm fine. Nora's mouth curved. It was the smile he remembered, the one that started slow and then broke open like something surprised by its own warmth, the one that had cost less for years and was finding its way back to its full size now, incrementally, in the specific unhurried way that things grow back when you give them the right conditions and stop demanding they grow faster than they can. He felt it in his chest like a struck note. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. The radiator knocked. The November wind moved through the old trees on Prescott Street, bare now, the branches making the particular sound that bare branches make in wind, a dry, specific percussion that belonged to this season and no other. Damien Moretti, who had spent 15 years building an empire on fear and certainty and the carefully maintained illusion of control, sat in a kitchen in the ordinary light and felt, for the first time in as long as he could locate, that the room he was in had no hidden architecture, no locks on the inside, no exits that only opened one way, just a table, 2 cups of coffee, a hand on the back of his hand, and in the next room, his son, picking up chess pieces off the floor with the patient, methodical persistence of a small person who has knocked something over, assessed the damage, and decided the correct response is to simply put it back together. One piece at a time. That was all. That was everything.